right, welcome back to part 3 of our overview of Sage Intacct's multi-book functionality. In this part, we're going to focus on statistical account tracking. So with statistical accounts, what we get the ability to do is track non-financial metrics via a separate book. Again, similar to how we're tracking allocations, or in the previous part, we went over the purchasing commitments. So similar idea, only even more robust functionality here, where we can embed non-financial metrics and actually do computations and reports and whatnot on these statistical entries. So, examples of this may be things like your employee headcount, your FTE. Could be things like your warehouse square footage or number of customers, contracts, number of projects, number of grants for nonprofits, number of events if you're maybe a caterer, or you're in the hospitality industry. Could have number of restaurant seats, right? Or open hotel rooms is another great example, right? Number of open hotel rooms versus booked rooms. This gives you the ability to actually track this via a separate book within Intacct, and again, do lots of forecasting, budgeting, reporting on these non-financial metrics. So if you look at my dashboard here, if you recall from our previous blog videos, that we reviewed our member metrics dashboard here, right? And I was pointing out earlier that what we're looking at in some circumstances here are statistical and financial data computed together, right? Things like our average CMRR, our revenue renewals, our customer renewals, things like that, customer acquisition costs, right? These types of computations are basically combining our financial and non-financial metrics. And these are really kind of, again, entered in various ways, similar, however, to how you'd enter a standard journal entry. So let's just take a quick look here. And if we were to look at our general ledger kind of setup, of course, we've got our standard general ledger accounts and we've got our dimensions, but we also have a separate statistical account setup. We can have unlimited types of statistical accounts. Just a few examples here. I've got my customer count, I've got my employee head count, I've got hours, billable, non-billable, utilized, so on and so forth, meals served, right? Again, depending on the industry you're in, these can be very tailored to your needs and metrics that you may want to track. So once we establish our statistical accounts, what that gives us the ability to do is actually do statistical journal entries. So you can see here, in fact, as part of native functionality, I've got the ability to add statistical journal entries. So I could go in and I could actually look at my transactions for various types of statistical entries, like employee headcount, active employees. There are certain dimensions in the system, I should mention, that we can actually have the system auto count. Things like projects or grants or number of customers, number of vendors, things like that. These actually can be set up and then configured in the system to actually have the system auto count and create these entries on its own. So that's actually really useful too, depending on the types of dimensions you may have set up. But that being said, if there are certain things the system can't auto count, things like employee head count, we can have the system configured to count the employee dimension. But if we don't set up all our employees as part of an employee dimension, which oftentimes that may be the case if you've got operational employees that aren't in the system and you don't want to set all of them up, right? Then we can load these entries in various ways. So one way is just a standard manual entry. Again, just as if I were going to do a journal entry, I'd come in and add my entry here. Now note, when I go to my statistical journal entries, only statistical type journals can be chosen and selected here. But what I'm doing here is then selecting that account, right? Maybe I'm doing employee head count and I'm doing an increase or decrease. There's the difference between a standard journal entry, which is dollar amount, right? And this is an increase or decrease. And note that we can set up the accounts to be sort of a cumulative or a net effect, meaning that we look at month-end balances, or we could set it up to report off of the net change. So depending on what you're kind of tracking and how you want to report on those, you can configure both ways. So that's one way manually, but of course, now we have the other more automated ways, which would be recurring. Set up recurring entries, put it on a schedule. That's another method. Have the system just generate it, monthly or weekly or quarterly, however often you want that schedule to go and post. Another method being standard imports, right? If we were looking at standard import functionality in the system, we can come in and import our data. And again, just as a standard journal entry, we can come in and we can actually import our statistical entries, right? Here's our statistical journal entry, and I can download that template and just populate that in Excel very easily and convert that to CSV and upload that every month, again, every week, every day if you so chose. Again, very easy to get it in the system and just use that import template. Another even more seamless way would be an integration through the API. So again, there's some caveats to that if you're utilizing web service license, or maybe you have an integration to your medical billing system, or again your POS system, and you want to count number of meals and things like that, versus number of drinks versus number of seats turned over. So you can absolutely do that via the API as well. And again, we've seen lots of kind of clever ways or clever data sets to actually bring in and actually get a really meaningful set of reports in the system via integrations through the API as well. So that's another method by which to get our stat entries in the system. So once we do that, again, and we get these transactions posted, they're just sitting in another book, much like our standard accrual book, right? And that allows us to do things like report on them very simply. If I come in here and just run a customer account report, this is just my standard financial report writer. In here, I could easily come in and say, you know what, show me as of 12/31/2019. There's my customer account month over month. And I can see I've actually got it separated my account groups by beginning customers, new, loss, customers at the end of the period. What does this gap mean? Well, remember that metrics dashboard where we can see customer churn and we can see new customer acquisition costs, things like that. That's how we get that data computed with our financial sets, right? And again, this is just easily available in our financial report writer, just as if I were reporting on, again, standard revenue or expenses out of my accrual book. Another visual way to see that is if I pull up my dashboard here for the executive services. So let me just do this. I'm going to pull up my role-based exec services dashboard. And if you look at my top report here, I've got a set of project financials. Now, this is just all of my active projects down the left-hand side here. And I've got all the financial data across as columns individually here, right? My AR, my bill, my revenue. However, if you look at my fourth column over, these are hours worked. These are actual statistical entries embedded in a financial project P&L. So I can actually see project by project my total hours worked. I can also budget by these. So I could actually have a budget hours versus hours actual, right? And I could embed that in any financial or operating report for that matter. If I drill in, of course, I'm going to see that these are all going to my stat journal entry, right? So there we go. We're seeing my increases or decreases directly to that stat journal entry. And in this case, it's just hours worked, so it's always going to be an increase, right? So again, that capability of being able to embed and or compute statistical metrics alongside financial data is part of that powerful multi-book functionality. Now, one more thing I'd like to show you here before we close out is another method by which we can utilize our statistical metrics. And this relates to a module we have called dynamic allocations. Now, dynamic allocations allow for a much more robust allocation functionality in the system. It's a whole nother blog topic that we won't get into in this. But what I do want to show you really quickly is just the setup of my allocation definitions. and I'm going to look at allocation of fringe benefits here, my fringe benefits expense. So this would be all my overhead that I'm allocating across a department, right? So my department is my allocation focus. Now, this particular allocation setup, right, is basically looking at a source pool of all my benefits expense. It's a combination of overhead GL accounts. I'm allocating all of that out 100%. And down here, my basis is currently it's based on salaries and wages. So what this tells the system to do is look at total salaries and wages by department, calculate a percentage, and then use that percentage to spread out all the overhead. Okay. Well, what if I have a better way to do that? And that would be via our statistical entries. So I can come in here and switch my basis from a financial metric to a statistical metric. Now what I can do is come in and say, hey, instead of looking at salaries and wages and calculating it off that, I'm going to look at headcount. This is really common in doing sort of month-end allocations or quarterly allocations, right? I'm going to use my FTE or my headcount to disperse my, overhead or sort of non-operating expenses across departments or cost centers, right? So what I can do is come in here and there's all my stat entries, right? Or my stat accounts, I should say. I can select my employee headcount. And now, again, I've changed my basis to look at total employees by department, spread out overhead based on employee count, right? So, a great way in which to, again, utilize dynamic allocations combined with those statistical entries, right? Lots of other use cases out there. I just want to show this one really quickly, a very simple example with headcount. And of course, one more thing to point out is that I have this actually going to an allocations alternate book, right? So again, that multi-book functionality comes into play where I'm actually saying, you know what, do all my dynamic overhead or fringe benefits allocations, put them to a separate book, not my accrual book, because I want to be able to remember book stacking. I want to stack that on top of my accrual book to show with or without allocations, my set of month-end financials. So kind of in wrap, this dynamic allocation function allows us to use both financial and or statistical metrics in which to sort of spread out or use as a basis for our allocations. So again, I appreciate everyone's time in watching these vlogs. Hopefully I've gotten across here the real power in Sage Intacct with our multi-book functionality and quite a few, kind of giving you a few example use cases, but there's, sort of, as I mentioned before, the sky's the limit and where you can use these, how you can use these. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to Equation Technologies. Myself or anyone on our team be happy to answer questions, demo additional functionality, or give you more examples. So thank you and appreciate the time.